So today I'm going to try to convince you that verb metaphors are processed as analogies are. And if you're wondering what the meaning of these paintings are that I have here, this is me shamelessly trying to capture your interest. So the meaning will be revealed throughout my talk. So stay tuned. Okay, so when I say sentences like, the year crawled painfully to a close, I sailed through my exams, these are, of course, examples of verbs being used metaphorically. And it turns out that in psycholinguistics, verb metaphor is actually much less studied than noun metaphor. So why should you care? Let me take a second to sell you on why verb metaphor is important. So one problem with knowing less about verb metaphor than noun metaphor processing is that there's actually evidence that verb metaphor is more common than noun metaphor in day-to-day language. We also know that metaphor is an important driver of language change. And in fact, there's actually evidence that verbs change meaning over time more rapidly than nouns do. So this is a chart from a really cool study by Dubosarski et al., which shows the rates of meaning change for verbs, nouns, and adjectives over a century. So x-axis is time, the y-axis is the rate of semantic change. And you can see that verbs, the dashed line here, everyone can see my pointer, right, on the screen? Okay, good. So verbs are changing faster and substantially faster than nouns and adjectives over the entire period of analysis. But despite all this, work on verb metaphor processing is pretty limited at the moment. So today, the goal of the work I'm going to present is to provide a novel, empirically supported process account for how we comprehend verb metaphors. So in today's talk, I'm going to begin by outlining my proposed process model, and I'm going to make what might seem like a surprising proposal, and that's that verb metaphors like the van limped, the boat pranced, and the rumor strutted are processed in the same way that analogies are. So I'll introduce 5 predictions that arise from applying the analogical framework that we all know and love to verb metaphors. And then for each prediction, I'm going to review experimental work we've done that supports that prediction. So to begin, if I'm saying that verb metaphors are processed as analogies, a good place to start is to ask how analogies in general are processed. In this work, I'm assuming that analogies are processed as comparisons. And since there's strong support in the literature for the structure mapping model of analogy, that's the framework that I'm going to use moving forward. So many of you are probably already familiar with how structure mapping works, but for those that aren't, let me just briefly review. So say we have an analogy like misinformation is like a virus. So structure mapping assumes that analogies involve hierarchical, relationally structured conceptual representations. So here's our representation for virus, which is the base of the analogy. And here's our representation for misinformation, which is the target of the analogy. So structure mapping models analogical comparisons as taking place in 2 key stages. In the first stage of structure mapping, the 2 representations are placed into alignment or compared, and a mapping process identifies common relational structure based on matching semantic relations. So here the common structure is shown in yellow. So by comparing misinformation to virus, we identify that they have the abstract commonalities that both spread rapidly among people. So after mapping is complete, inference projection occurs where relational structure that's connected to the map structure that's in the base but not present in the target is projected from the base to the corresponding location in the target. And so because the earlier mapping stage has identified that both viruses and misinformation spread rapidly among people, and because we know that vaccines can reduce the spread of viruses, we may infer that perhaps we can develop a vaccine for misinformation as well. And in fact, researchers are looking into this very thing, some of them at Northwestern. So in this way, structure mapping accounts for the 2 hallmarks of analogy. They serve to highlight abstract commonalities between unlike concepts, and they're informative. They lead to new insights or inferences about the target. Okay, so we know that analogies like misinformation is like a virus are understood by comparing misinformation to virus. So if I'm arguing that verb metaphors are also analogies, it follows that they're also processed as comparisons. So for a verb metaphor like the van limped, this suggests that we understand it by comparing van to limped. But that seems kind of crazy. It seems nonsensical to say that a van is like limped because we know that verbs typically denote events, in this case, limping, while nouns typically denote entities, in this case, a van. So it doesn't really make sense to compare an event to an entity. So what's being compared? Well, let me prime your intuitions by saying that noun-verb comparisons are actually pretty common in English. So we regularly say things like cry like a baby, shake like a leaf, absorb like a sponge. We can do this metaphorically, like her prose flowed like a river. So what's going on? Well, in each case, the nouns are activating canonical events that they're frequent participants in. So we know from experience that babies often cry, leaves often shake, sponges often absorb, and rivers often flow. And it turns out that there's a rich literature demonstrating that an important part of our knowledge of nouns are the events that they frequently participate in. And I'll review this literature in a few slides. So in addition to denoting entities, nouns also activate event schemas. So to return to the question of what's being compared during verb metaphor comprehension, the answer is two event schemas, the noun event and the verb event. So let's look at some example verb metaphors. So the van limped, the rumor strode, and the guitar trudged. So we know from our experiences in the world that vans frequently are involved in drive events, rumors are frequently spreading, and guitars are frequently playing. And we can actually see this reflected in people's actual interpretations of these metaphors. So let's take a look. So for the van limped, we get the damaged vehicle drove slowly down the road. For the rumor strode, we get the gossip spread steadily. And for the guitar trudge, one person interpreted this as the guitar strings were sticky when plucked and were very slow to react. So clearly, participants are activating their knowledge of what these nouns typically do. So we see driving, we see spreading, we see sticky strings getting plucked. And I just want to emphasize, none of these events are mentioned in the original sentence. But clearly, participants are activating them when they're interpreting these metaphors. So if nouns are activating these event schemas and verbs are denoting event schemas, it makes a lot more sense to think about comparing two event structures. And that's what I'm proposing here. So I'm proposing that verb metaphors are processed as comparisons between the verb event, which is the base of the analogy, and an event schema activated by the noun, which is the target. Okay, so as analogies, we expect that verb metaphors like the van limped are understood via the same two-stage process I just walked through. So the verb is compared to the event schema activated by the noun. So we have our representation for limped on the right and our representation for drive on the left here, which is the schema activated by van. So in the alignment phase, as before, commonalities between the noun event and the verb event are identified. So in this case, both driving and limping are forms of physical movement over land. And since we know that both driving and limping involve physical motion, and we also know that limping denotes motion that occurs in an impaired manner, we infer that the van's driving also occurred in an impaired manner. And we get our interpretation of the damaged vehicle drove slowly down the road. All right, so this claim that verbs are compared to noun events requires evidence that nouns activate events. We saw some of this in the paraphrases. And luckily, there's also a lot of direct experimental evidence for this as well. And I'll just briefly review that next before moving on to my second claim here. Okay, so recently there's been a lot of exciting work showing that the events that nouns frequently participate in, like the things that a noun typically does, are an important part of our knowledge of nouns. So when we encounter babies, they're frequently crying. Crying is an event saliently associated with babies. And researchers in this field have called this event knowledge generalized event knowledge. And the generalized part comes from the fact that we learn these event categories by abstracting over our experiences in the world. And this results in us building up a generalized event schema. So we know that we learn words in general by abstracting over different exemplars that we encounter. So we learn a verb like throw by abstracting over exemplar throwing events. And we build up our generalized throw event schema. In the same way, we learn entity noun categories like van by abstracting over different van exemplars that we encounter. But we don't experience entities like van in a void. We also frequently experience them doing something, and we frequently experience vans driving. So our representation of vans comes to include a generalized event schema related to driving. So there's substantial work showing these noun events are critical in literal sentence processing. So there's evidence that nouns automatically activate event schemas representing the events that those nouns frequently participate in the world. And they do so on the same timescales of what's traditionally thought of as lexical access. And there's also evidence that these noun event structures are quickly integrated with the verb. So I'll just review one study quickly. Kamide et al. Used a visual array paradigm to show that people make anticipatory looks towards objects that they expect to be the patient of a verb based on the preceding noun and verb together. So when people hear the sentence, the man will ride they make anticipatory looks to the motorcycle. When they hear the girl will ride, they look to the carousel. But if the verb is taste, they'll look to the beer for man and the candy for girl. This was 2003. Maybe the participants weren't as enlightened as we are today, but nevertheless, I think the results show that both the noun and verb event together are used to make predictions. And so my proposal is just that much of the same thing is occurring during metaphoric processing. Okay, so now we all agree that nouns activate event schemas. And so now I'll turn to the rest of the presentation is going to focus on this second, that the noun event and verb event are integrated as analogies. All right, so applying the analogy framework to verb metaphors gives us 5 predictions. So first, we predict a verb mutability effect, meaning that we expect the verb will change meaning more than the noun. Second, we predict we predict that the similarity between the noun event and the verb event will determine the type and degree of verb meaning change, and following a pattern that we call minimal subtraction. Third, we expect that verb metaphor comprehension involves the projection of inferences from the verb to the noun, resulting in the verb further specifying the noun event. The fourth prediction is that under structure mapping, we expect that the degree of similarity between the noun event and the verb event will predict comprehension speed. And the fifth prediction is under structure mapping, we expect that comprehension will be facilitated by prior activation of relevant event structure. So these first 3 predictions all center on patterns of meaning change that occur when verbs extend their meanings metaphorically. And my goal is to show that this model provides a natural framework for explaining how these patterns arise during comprehension. And the last 2 predictions are online predictions focused on the mapping process as it unfolds. And I'll try to show that these patterns are consistent with a structure mapping process. So for the rest of the presentation, I'm going to go through each prediction one by one. And for each one, I'll start with the relevant theory from analogy, and I'll show how it extends to the verb metaphor case. Okay, so the first prediction is the verb mutability effect. So we know analogies like this misinformation or virus are understood by comparing the base and the target and highlighting what they have in common. So what's important is that the target of the analogy, which is misinformation, is understood literally, right? So we really are talking about misinformation in a literal sense. But the same is not true for the base. So the result of the comparison process is that only the components of the base meaning that it shares with the target are retained and the rest are discarded, right? So in this case, we retain the components of virus's meaning having to do with rapid spread among people because it shares that with misinformation, but we discard irrelevant surface level meaning components like, the fact that it's viral particles, being transmitted through the air or through fluids. This turned out to be a more relevant example than I thought. Okay, so the target is understood literally and the base becomes abstracted as a result of the comparison process. And again, since the target is the literal referent, we really are talking about misinformation and we retain surface level, relevant surface level features like that it's, say, transmitted via link. So applying the same logic to verb metaphors, where the verb's the base of the analogy and the noun is the target, we expect the same pattern. So the noun should serve as the literal referent, and the verb should become adaptive or abstracted. So say I have a bunch of verb metaphors like the motor complained, the speech limped, and the lizard worshipped. So notice in the, so here's some example interpretations. So from people. So the engine made a strange sound, the talk was slow and boring, the reptile stared unblinkingly at the sun. So notice that in each case, people have preserved the meaning of the noun. So motor goes to engine, speech goes to talk, lizard goes to reptile, but they've changed the meaning of the verb. So complained, made a strange sound, limped, was slow and boring, worshipped, stared unblinkingly at the sun. So there's a lot of verb change there. And in principle, in these sentences, there's only one noun and one verb. So you could have changed either to interpret the sentence, but people strongly prefer to change the meaning of the verb. And this suggests a pattern consistent with our prediction here, which is a phenomenon called the verb mutability effect. And also, as you might have guessed, we have now revealed the meaning of the first image on my PowerPoint. So I told DALL-E to generate an image of a painting of a lizard worshiping. And this is the best one, and it's actually pretty good. So not too bad. And for those that don't know, DALL-E is one of those AI image generation things. Okay, so the verb mutability effect is the idea that verbs are more likely to adapt their meanings to the noun than the reverse. And this effect increases with the degree of semantic strain. What strain? Well, it's when a noun violates the verb's selectional preferences. So for a sentence like, the professor complained expects a human noun subject and it receives one, so the sentence is literal or unstrained. But if you give it a subject noun like motor, it's now no longer literally interpretable and it becomes strained. And if you give it a noun like tree, it becomes even further strained because unlike motors, which aren't human but still saliently make noise, trees are both non-human and aren't particularly noisy. So the first experiment I'll talk about today, we tested the verb mutability effect. So we had participants paraphrase simple intransitive sentences that varied in their degree of semantic strain. All the stimuli in all the experiments I'm going to discuss today are intransitive sentences with one noun and one verb, and that allows us to compare their behavior directly. And participants interpreted each sentence without repeating the original noun or verb, and we used word2vec to assess the degree of noun and verb change that occurred from the stimulus sentence to the paraphrase. So a quick primer for those who aren't familiar on word2vec, it's a vector space word embedding model. And the key idea is that it's trained on a large data set and words come to be represented as high dimensional vectors. And so this means that the similarity between any two words is quantified as the cosine of the angle between those two vectors. So what that means is that you can compare two pieces of text and get a similarity score, where scores close to 1 indicate high similarity and scores close to 0 indicate low similarity. So if we compare professor to teacher, we get a similarity score of 0.83, whereas if we compare truck to cat, we get 0.08. So word2vec gives us a nice hands-off way to assess meaning change. Okay, so for time, I'm not going to go into detail about our specific methodology using word2vec. Happy to answer questions after. But for each paraphrase, we used it to assess how much the stimulus, noun, and verb changed under the paraphrase. So in this case, lower scores mean greater meaning change. So for example, if we have the motor complained and the engine made a strange sound, we use word2vec to see how much the noun changed, and we get a score of 0.78. And we use it the same way to see how much the verb changed, and we get a score of 0.15. And again, since lower scores indicate greater meaning change, this matches our intuition that the verb has changed more than the noun. Okay, so what are our predictions? First, we expect verbs, but not nouns, are going to change meaning in response to strain. And second, we expect that the degree of meaning change will increase with the degree of strain. All right, here's the result. So verbs are in orange, nouns are in blue. The x-axis is the degree of semantic strain, so it increases from left to right. Word2vec scores on the y-axis, and again, lower scores mean greater meaning change. So consistent with the verb mutability effect, we see that verbs change their meaning in response to strain, but nouns did not. The greater the degree of strain, the further they change their meanings, but not for nouns. One thing I'm kind of skipping over because it's not too relevant for this talk is that we tested both low and high polysemy nouns and verbs. So that's what the two lines are for. So we compared nouns and verbs with 1 to 2 meanings to those with 7 or more meanings. And so the key takeaway here is that the number of meanings does not explain verb mutability, because you can see that verbs with 1 to 2 meanings change meaning at an equal rate to those with 7 or more meanings. Whereas the number of meanings, again, did not matter for noun meaning change in terms of response to strain. And I'll also just mention that we replicated our Word2vec scores with a behavioral method using people. And let me just show you a couple examples from the study. So the bell complained, the alarm rang annoyingly, the lantern lit, the light was flickering, the car agreed, the vehicle responded well to the driver. So people are really pretty good at adapting these verbs to the noun using metaphoric extension. And I'll just note again, we see noun events surfacing in the paraphrases. So the alarm's ringing, lanterns producing light, cars are driving. Again, none of this mentioned in the original sentence, but popping up in the paraphrases. Okay, so to summarize prediction 1, in analogies, the target serves as the literal referent, while the base's meaning becomes adapted or abstracted as the result of the comparison. And our findings on verb mutability show that the same pattern holds in verb metaphors, with the noun serving as the literal referent and the verb's meaning abstracted as it's adapted to the noun. Okay, maybe I'll pause here. Are there any quick clarification questions that are needed? Maybe we'll save deeper questions for the end, but this is kind of the paradigm for the rest of the studies. So if there's anything confusing about the design. Okay, so Margarita, are there any questions or?
No, not any.
Okay, good. Okay, so second prediction. The second prediction is that verb meaning change follows a minimal subtraction pattern during metaphoric comprehension. Right, so in analogies, the similarity between two concepts is defined as the degree of conceptual structure that's shared between them. And in this talk, I'm going to use the term conceptual structure to include both higher order relational structure and also the objects and attributes they take as arguments when those are part of the mapping. And you'll see what I'm talking about. So this example here, the base and target, they're highly similar. So the mapping process identifies a lot of common structure. But if we compare the same target to a less similar base, less common structure will be identified. So the structure mapping engine, which is the algorithmic implementation of structure mapping, always seeks to preserve as much common structure as possible. So it will retain as many lower order features as possible when they're common to both concepts. But the more dissimilar the two concepts become, the less common structure the mapping process will identify, resulting in greater abstraction of the base, but not the target. So, for example, say we have a comparison like an isthmus is like a bridge. So isthmuses and bridges are literally similar in a lot of ways. They share both domain-specific commonalities, like they're both physical structures that span a physical gap of some sort. They also share domain-general commonalities, like they allow objects to cross something that would otherwise be impossible. But if we have a comparison like and education is like a bridge. Education and bridge aren't literally similar at all, of course. So they only share highly abstract domain general relational commonalities. So they both allow you to metaphorically process metaphorical. So while the target, again, remains the literal referent, comparison results in greater base abstraction as the base and target become less similar. All right, so applying this to verb metaphors, our model predicts that the degree of similarity between the verb event and the noun event should determine the degree of abstraction that the verb undergoes. So a shorter way to talk about this degree of similarity between events is the term semantic strain. So previously I said it was the extent to which the noun violates the verb's selectional preferences. But this theory provides a more specific definition, which is that we can think of strain as being the degree of similarity between the noun event and the verb event. So as strain increases, so should the degree of meaning change. Okay, so hopefully I can make this clearer with an example. So say we have three nouns, the woman, the wagon, the rumor, and we have our verb limped. Each one combined with limped, so the woman limped, the wagon limped, and the rumor limped. And let's say we're pairing, so we paired each noun with the verb. And so when we encounter the noun woman, we have plenty of experiences where women are using their legs to move around, as we all do. So this sentence is unstrained, and limped can retain its typical literal meaning of, say, physical movement via legs occurring in an impaired manner. And so we get an interpretation like the female walked unevenly. Now, the noun wagon activates a roll event schema, since we frequently experience wagons rolling across the ground in our lives. So we compare this event schema with our limped schema, and we find that rolling shares some, but not all domain-specific features with limping. So they're both forms of physical movement, but rolling involves wheels and not legs. So limp's meaning becomes a little more general as a result of the comparison, and we get an interpretation like the cart bumped and rolled awkwardly down the street. And lastly, an abstract noun activates, like rumor, activates a spread event schema, and that shares no domain-specific structure with limped. So after comparison, we're left with only a highly domain general abstraction of limped, where only the notion that a general change of state is unfolding in an impaired manner. So we get an interpretation like the gossip did not spread easily. So strain, as we just defined it, is increasing as we go down. And as strain increases, we predict that so too will the degree of verb abstraction. Okay, so we're calling this predicted pattern of meaning change minimal subtraction, and we're defining it in terms of three principles that hopefully are made clear by the previous slide. So verb change increases progressively with strain. They change only as far as necessary to resolve the strain, and domain-specific components are altered before more abstract ones. Okay, so the next two experiments I'll present tested this hypothesis. So the idea was to systematically strain each verb we tested at three different levels using three different types of nouns. So we had human nouns like woman, artifact nouns like wagon, and abstract nouns like rumor. And we tested three different verb classes. So manner of motion verbs like limped or waddled, manner of speaking like whispered, cackled, stammered, and bodily process verbs like burped, panted, and spat. So by pairing each verb with each type of noun, we create sentence triplets of three different levels of similarity between the noun event and the verb event, and three different levels of strain. So in this design, minimal subtraction predicts three levels of progressively increasing verb meaning change, which we would see reflected in progressively lower word-to-vec scores. And qualitatively, we expect three distinct levels of verb abstraction from domain-specific to domain general direction. Okay, so experiment 2 focused on the quantitative predictions. So we used the same paraphrase and word-to-vec paradigm as in experiment 1. There were 18 nouns, 54 verbs, a total of 162 sentences of varying levels of strain. And again, we used word-to-vec to assess meaning change. Here's our nouns. So we had 6 of each type. Human nouns, artifact nouns, which were all vehicles like plane, boat, scooter, and abstract nouns like melody, wisdom, rumor. and we had our 18 verbs in each of 3 classes. So for time, I'm just going to focus on manner of motion verbs. So we paired each verb with a noun from each type to create sentences at 3 levels of strain. And again, participants paraphrase these sentences and we assess change using word feedback. Okay, so here's the results. On the x-axis is noun type. So strain increasing from left to right. On the y-axis is word to vec score. So again, lower scores mean greater meaning change. The first thing to notice is we've replicated the verb mutability effect. So verbs are changing in response to strain, but nouns aren't. We also see that the pattern of change is consistent with minimal subtraction. So as we predicted, there's 3 increasing levels of meaning change corresponding to the 3 different noun types. And verb is only changing as far as necessary, as demanded by the noun. So when people encounter a little bit of strain, they're not just throwing all the verb's meaning away, they're retaining as much as possible. And again, that's predicted by structure mappings. The structure mapping engines aim to always retain as much structure as possible. Okay, so here's just a couple example paraphrases, because I think they're fun. I'll read one. The husband paced, the wife's significant other walked back and forth. The scooter paced, the vehicle moved steadily, and the rumor paced, the gossip went back and forth. So again, people are really good at adapting the verb in very fine-grained ways to the noun. Okay, so we found evidence supporting our first 2 predictions of minimal subtraction. And so now in experiment 3, we'll focus on the qualitative prediction. Domain-specific components are altered before relational ones. So to test this, we did a verb meaning component coding task, where we identified which components of the original verb's meaning were retained in the paraphrases from the experiment I just described. So we gave those paraphrases to a new group of participants. And so this is what it looked like. So in this example, the original sentence is the rumor limped, and the participants did not see that. They did see the paraphrase. In this case, the gossip did not spread easily. And for each one, they indicated whether the sentence described physical motion involving legs, physical motion not involving legs, metaphorical motion, no physical or metaphorical motion, or unsure. So hopefully we can agree here that the right answer is metaphorical motion. And the key thing to notice is that the degree of verb abstraction represented by each code is increasing from left to right. And we're moving from retaining domain-specific meaning components to more domain general ones. And these final 2 categories are basically other categories. They don't represent any particular degree of abstraction. Okay, so here's the results. The rows correspond to the type of noun in the stimulus sentence, so strain increasing as we go down. These are the codes from the previous slide, so abstraction increasing as you go from left to right for the first 3 codes. The numbers in the cell are the percentage of paraphrases that correspond to that category for that row. And the shaded cells are what should be most frequent under minimal subtraction predictions. So as you can see, the pattern of abstraction matched our predictions. So when the verb was paired with the human noun, it retained its full literal meaning. So we get the student marched, the child walked through the school. When it was paired with an artifact noun, it retains some, but not all components of its meaning related to physical motion. So the van marched, the large vehicle moved steadily forward. When it was paired with an abstract noun, like the mood marched, its meaning became fully abstracted out of the physical domain, and we get a paraphrase like the intense feelings moved powerfully. So as predicted by minimal subtraction, we see this nice graduated pattern of abstraction, domain specific to domain general meaning components. And again, participants are trying to retain as much of the verb's original meaning as they can, depending on the noun. So to summarize our second prediction, in analogies, the similarity between the base and target predicts the degree of base change. And for verb metaphors, the similarity between the verb event and the noun event predicts the degree of verb change. Okay, prediction 3. We predict that if verb metaphors are processed as analogies, we expect inferences will be projected from the verb to the noun. So we discussed this a little earlier, but as we saw with our analogy, misinformation is like a virus. Identifying commonalities between the base and target can lead to inferences about the target based on those identified commonalities. So in this case, we identify that both misinformation and viruses spread rapidly. We also know that vaccines reduce the spread of viruses. And since that information is connected to our identified commonality, it may lead us to infer that we can vaccinate against misinformation, just like we do with viruses. So again, under structure mapping, the inference is being projected or donated from the base virus to the target misinformation. Applying this framework to verb metaphors like the wagon limped, this means we expect that the verb event, which is the base of the analogy, will project inferences to the noun event, which is the target. So for the wagon limped, we again identified that limping and rolling are both physical motion over land. Again, rolling is the event schema activated by wagon. Our knowledge of limping tells us that it's physical motion that unfolds in an impaired manner. So we infer that the wagon's rolling event also occurs in an impaired manner. And so we get our interpretation of the cart bumped and rolled awkwardly down the street. And just as with analogies in general, we have inference projection from the base to the noun. And we have rich evidence of this occurring in our participant paraphrases. So let's just look at some more. Never get enough paraphrases. So the van prowled, the car drove forward slowly and sneakily. So we can see that the drive event is unfolding in a manner consistent with a prowling event, namely that it's happening slowly and sneakily. For the violin stammer, the way that the violin plays matches how a stammering event unfolds with quick repetitions. So we get the violin played quick repeated notes. For the boat waddled, the way the ship moves on the water occurs in a manner consistent with how waddling occurs. So back and forth. And so we get the ship rocked back and forth on the water and so on. And so the key takeaway is in each case, information is being projected from the verb to the noun. The van's moving slowly and sneakily, the violin's playing quick repeated notes. And clearly that information is coming from the verb and being combined with the noun's prototypical event. So I think this is nice evidence showing inference projection is occurring from the verb to the noun. Okay, so to summarize, in analogies, comparison leads to the projection of inferences from the base to the target. And in verb metaphor, we see the same pattern of inference projection from the verb event to the noun event. Okay, so far, this talk is focused on trying to capture the types of interpretations that people give for verb metaphors. And we found strong patterns across studies for how verbs behave during verb comprehension. And I've argued that treating verb metaphors as analogies provides a natural framework for explaining these patterns. For these final two predictions, we turn to investigating the process itself. So we're going to focus now on the structure mapping process specifically, and both will be tested using online methodologies to investigate processing in real time. I think that I'm probably gonna, I've been throwing a lot of information at you. Your eyes may be glazed over at this time. So I think for time, I'm gonna just touch on this fourth prediction and spare you most of the details, but I'll give you the gist. Okay, so the fourth prediction is that event similarity predicts comprehension speed. So in structure mapping theory, similar concepts are easier, faster to align because similar concepts have more structure in common. So it's easier to compare an apple to an orange than it is to compare an apple to a guitar. So this makes them easier to align, which makes them faster to align. And we expect verb metaphors where the noun event and verb event are similar should also be faster to align. So a metaphor where the noun event and verb event are both about motion, like the van strutted, should be faster to comprehend than one where the two events are from different domains, like the violin strutted. So in this case, the noun event is about sound, whereas the verb event is about motion. So in the experiment, I'm going to skip over. We tested to see whether participants were slower to interpret verb metaphors where the noun event and verb event were dissimilar, like the violin strutted, compared to metaphors like the van strutted, where the noun event and verb event are similar. And so the upshot is the results were largely consistent with our hypothesis. There's still some open questions that we're following up on there. And absolutely happy to return to this experiment after if you guys are interested. So let me just skip ahead. I will share a couple paraphrases from the experiment because I think they're cool. So I like the piano babbled, the pianist played free-flowing music with no structure, the van babbled, the engine of the van hummed and stuttered like a baby as it whirred to life. And I'll just once again point out, we really see the presence of noun events here. The jet is flying, the horn is honking. And in each case, that event is being modified with information from the verb. So it's flying back and forth, it's honking repeatedly, and etc. Okay, so to summarize, prediction 4, structure mapping theory, similar concepts are easier, faster to align, and verb metaphor, we have some evidence that similar event concepts are easier, faster to align. Okay, so our final prediction, prediction 5, priming relevant noun event structure will speed metaphor comprehension. Okay, so in analogies, structure mapping results in greater activation of the mapped or common structure compared to unmapped structure. So it just means that the structure that was relevant, that's relevant to the meaning of the analogy, will be activated more than structure that's irrelevant to the meaning of analogy. Now, for verb metaphors, since the mapping's between two event schemas, this predicts that structure mapping will activate common or relevant event structure more than structure that's irrelevant to the meaning of the metaphor. So it follows that if prior to alignment, we prime event structure that will be mapped, so event structure that's going to be relevant to the ultimate verb metaphor, that should speed alignment. So if I prime relevant structure in the noun event, that should result in faster comprehension times. Whereas if I prime irrelevant structure in the noun event, we expect less facilitation because the structure being primed isn't relevant to the meaning of the metaphor. So the final experiment I'm going to present is a pilot. We just completed that tested this hypothesis. So we selected metaphors whose interpretations were predictable based on past studies we've done. So as an example, we have the metaphor, the boat burped, and it's typically interpreted as the ship let out a burst of steam. So for each metaphor, we selected 2 primes that preceded the metaphor presentation on each try. So the relevant noun event prime was selected to activate event structure in the noun event that was relevant to the meaning of the metaphor. And so because we know that the burping boat will be interpreted to be about steam release, the relevant prime here is smokestack, which activates event structure relevant to the emission of exhaust. The irrelevant prime, again, was selected to activate irrelevant structure to the meaning of the metaphor. So, for example, the noun anchor doesn't activate any sort of event structure related to boats burping. So the primes were always physical components of the subject noun in the metaphor, and they were all matched in terms of a priori relatedness to the stimulus noun and the stimulus verb using word vec. So the idea is to ensure that any observed effect isn't just due to simple differences in associative strength between the primes, but rather the effect of the prime, of the event structure that the prime is activating. So we predict that relevant primes will speed comprehension more than irrelevant primes. So we created 14 verb metaphors. For each one, we have a relevant prime and an irrelevant prime. The prime type was between subject. So for each item, the participants saw one of the primes. This was counterbalanced across subjects. Half the primes they saw were relevant. Each subject saw were relevant, half were irrelevant. And the idea was they got the prime, then the verb metaphor, and then they pressed the space bar as soon as they had thought of an interpretation, and then they typed their paraphrase. So the dependent measure is comprehension time. So time from the stimulus presentation to the space bar press. Okay, so the results, here's our paradigm for reference. Here's our reaction time. So on the x-axis, we have our prime type. The y-axis is RTs. And so as expected, people were significantly faster to interpret the verb metaphors that were preceded by the relevant prime than the irrelevant prime. So when people saw the word smokestack, they were faster to comprehend the boat burp than when they saw the word anchor. The last thing I'll note is I think this is additional evidence for the role of noun events in verb metaphor comprehension because these primes are components of the subject noun and they activate event structure relevant to the subject noun event. Nothing really to do with the verb there. And this also reveals the meaning of this second painting from the first slide. So for this one, I didn't get anything from Dali when I put in painting of a boat burping. So I had to do this and get this fairly disturbing image as a result. Okay, so that's everything. So to sum it all up, today I propose that verb metaphors are analogies, processed as comparisons between the event denoted by the verb and an event activated by the noun. And I presented evidence showing that verb metaphor comprehension follows the predictions that arise from applying the analogical framework. So first, I argued that for both analogies and verb metaphors, the target of the analogy is construed literally while the base becomes abstracted as a result of the comparison. Second, we saw that in both analogies and verb metaphors, the degree of similarity between the base and the target determines the degree of abstraction of the base, but not the target. As they become less similar, the base gradually becomes progressively more abstracted from domain specific to domain general meaning components. Third, we saw that understanding both analogies and verb metaphors can lead to the spontaneous generation of inferences about the target based on the identified commonalities between the base and the target. Fourth, we didn't see, but you trust me when I say that for both analogies and verb metaphors, the similarity between the base and the target predicts comprehension speed. So similar concepts are faster to understand than dissimilar concepts, and likewise for similar event concepts. And finally, we saw that priming relevant event structure, so structure that's involved in the meaning of the metaphor, speeds metaphor comprehension. The priming irrelevant structure does not. Okay, so thank you. I want to end by thanking my advisor and the rest of my lab, Nina, Sean, Porva, and Fanyi. What I've presented today has basically been 5.5 years of studies, which means they've all had to listen to 5.5 years of presentations and they've never complained about it. And their feedback has really been instrumental in shaping everything. And thanks to Dali for amusing us with its relative inability to interpret verb metaphors. And thank you all for listening.